As I say, I'm thrilled to be here to share some information about the BC labor market and some opportunities for talent. And I'm hoping that this will be somewhat interactive. As Diana mentioned, the format is I'm going to do a presentation and then Frank will do one. And then we're looking forward to having a dialogue with you. So a bit of a snapshot of BC's life sciences sector and Life Sciences BC, for those of you that aren't aware. We're a member-based not-for-profit association that advocates, supports, and represents BC's life sciences community provincially, nationally, and globally. We're a little unique in the sense that we do have the academic and research organizations along with industry, which would be defined as digital health, virtual health, medtech devices, diagnostics, biotech, many global companies. And then about 20% of our members are organizations that provide services into the sector or have identified life sciences as a strategic vertical. So those would be CROs, CMOs, consultants, accountants, lawyers. We even have architects, lab services companies, etc. So as Diana mentioned, we really are where the sector comes together in British Columbia. From a national perspective, you're probably all familiar with an organization called BioTalent Canada, one of our sister organizations. We partner with them on numerous activities and reports, and they're a great source of information for what's happening within the labor market macroly. They also have a bit of a broader definition of the bioeconomy than we do. In the sense that we're really mostly life sciences. And so I really encourage you to also go to their site to look at what's happening, what trends are happening. In addition, there are numerous programs that BioTalent Canada has that provide wage subsidies or other incentives, either for individuals or companies to be able to engage within the workforce. They released a study in 2021 that was a national one over the bioeconomy. And their study indicated that there were going to be 65,000 new workers by 2029. And the estimates were such that we were not going to, at the current rate, have enough workers to meet that demand. What that means is a massive opportunity for people working in the workforce, because there are more jobs available than current trained employees, and keeping yourself current and trained and looking at those trends of what skills are looking for will position you extremely well. Some of the shortages that they identified in the report were in biomanufacturing and processing. But as I will get into, there are gaps across many different areas. We've had a lot of activity, I'm sure you're aware, over the last few years, both within the pandemic and coming out. I guess, although we wouldn't necessarily say we're fully out of the pandemic, but we're certainly in a different stage. Canada released a biomanufacturing and life sciences strategy. BC did about a year ago, released our life sciences and biomanufacturing strategy. Importantly, it is co-signed with the Ministry of JEDI, Jobs, Economic Development and Innovation, and Health. And the execution of that strategy is actively being managed by both those ministries in British Columbia, which is great. We also have released an economic sector profile. This was a relaunch in May 2023. That was an update from a one that we'd done 3 years earlier. All of these are available on our website. It's a great source of information if you want to really deep dive into what's happening in the BC life sciences sector, not only from an economics perspective, but we also compare ourselves against the other provinces. In addition, there's a whole, almost half of the report talks about what I would refer to as the assets that we have here. So UBC and what some of those life sciences specific programs and infrastructure that we have, our research institutes, programs, etc. So here's some of the key statistics. We have 1,800 businesses actively employing people in British Columbia right now. That includes equates to about 28,000 people. We have approximately 900 businesses that currently are not employing people. And what that really means is very often as you are discovering something within an academic or research institution, you realize that you've got something discoverable, translatable, commercializable, and you'll start a company, but you're often still employed at whatever academic or research institution you reside in. That's the example of a company that may have been created, yet hasn't actively started employing individuals directly. I actually met with one yesterday out of UNBC. So there are 4 people working on the company, but they haven't got actually any employees yet because they're all doing it from other places that they're employed. From a GDP perspective, the sector is contributing $3.1 billion in British Columbia. That's up 27% over 3 years. It's also the second fastest growing sector in British Columbia. BC's home to Canada's fastest growing life sciences sector and has been for the last 6 years. In looking at the biotech sector alone, there has been $13 billion of investment coming in through global pharma in either acquisition, mergers, licensing, or BD deals. So very, very significant. And as I say, that only includes what's publicly available and only includes medtech. We've seen a 15% increase in labor market with graduate level education. 58% of life sciences workforce trained in BC. The others are coming in from outside of BC or outside of Canada. And what we also found was that we don't have a lot of information on diversity, equity, and inclusion, but we know we have a lot that we can build on in that particular area. The BC Life Sciences and Biomanufacturing Strategy that was released a year ago has 5 main pillars. One is about improving access to talent. So there's been numerous programs that have been new academic programs that have been launched. In addition, the Biomanufacturing Training Center is currently in the process of being built out. If you're not aware of it, it was announced about a year ago, specifically to train in biomanufacturing, and it's housed at BCIT's facility, and off the start, we'll be leveraging criteria from CASTLE, which is the Canadian Association of Training of Skills in Life Sciences. And CASTLE has the exclusive rights to the Irish NIBRT curriculum. That is what they're rolling out across Canada right now. Second pillar is around growing innovative companies. The third is around increasing biomanufacturing capacity and attracting anchor companies, expanding clinical trials, leveraging and commercializing research capacity. There have been significant and numerous investments over the last 12 months as it relates to life sciences in British Columbia. We had this announcement about the strategy. We had wet lab announcements that are being built out in both Vancouver and Vancouver Island. A significant announcement that was with the federal government and provincial government in Uppsala, which is in addition to building out biomanufacturing, building out clinical trials facilities, and or the ability to support clinical trials. There was an announcement in the Genome Sciences Center. A phase 1 clinical trials facility at Mount St. Joe's Hospital was announced in the fall. Triumph received $50 million from the provincial government. The St. Paul's Clinical Support Research Center, commonly called the CSRC, further research funding. So you sort of get the idea. There's been about 12 announcements over the last 12 months. There's many more initiatives that are being worked on. And the province really has identified life sciences as one of their top strategic sectors. So you can continue to see a lot of activity happening in British Columbia in collaboration with the federal government. We released a report in February titled Fostering a Globally Competitive Life Sciences Ecosystem in BC. This was essentially a labor market study that looked at the current trends today and the trends of the future and included forecasting, which I'm going to take you through. It was funded through the Ministry of Post-Secondary Education and Future Skills, which is what it was called at the time. That is currently called post-secondary skills and training. And so this is a program that had been existed. Actually, federal government gave provincial government money, and they looked at strategic sectors, and we were contracted to do the life sciences one. What we found, and this is probably the thing that is most relevant to all of you, is this is a projected forecast of the life sciences sector over the next 5 years. And the middle section says that we are expecting to have more than 5,000 jobs created, of which we do not see the direct linkage to being able to fill them. So it results in us really going back to what I said earlier, which the national picture is very similar in Ontario, Quebec, and BC, that we know that there are going to be jobs created, and we need to double down on being able to fill those jobs, which puts people like yourselves in a great opportunity as you consider the breadth of careers in life sciences and where you may want to engage. So identifying the talent gap. So what are these 5,500 jobs? We know thematically what they are, but what we're hoping to do is get a little bit more specificity over the next little while. But generally, they fall into 3 categories. C-suite jobs. So people that have experience in growing and building companies and very specifically attracting capital. Jobs that are in the sort of next level of management, so people with regulatory quality experience, biomanufacturing. It's not a surprise across the country that we don't have a lot of experience in biomanufacturing because we really didn't have a robust biomanufacturing ecosystem before the pandemic. So a lot in data management, bioengineers, system processing, R&D, and then, of course, that core biomanufacturing. As you saw in the strategy, clinical trials is a key focus, and there are lots of opportunities as we try and expand clinical trials as well. And if you're interested in that particular area, Clinical Trials BC is a great organization to connect with. They run numerous training programs to have people become trained and ready to engage in all the various different types of roles that are played in conducting clinical trials. In our labor market study, we looked at strengths. So core strengths were in talent attraction and retention. You would have seen that in that current slide where you saw 58% of people were trained in BC, but we've also been successful in recruiting people into BC. We have a very strong training system. Many of our leaders and CEOs in this sector will consistently say that we have some of the technically best candidates that are being produced. And I would argue that is the same for Ontario and Quebec. Generally, Canada has very strong technical training programs, so people come out extremely strong. What they will also say, though, is that very often people don't have the depth of knowledge of the industry that some people would like to see. So a little bit of advice is to keep yourself abreast with trends in the industry so that when you are looking at roles, you're able to not only demonstrate your technical strength, but you can demonstrate your knowledge of the sector and what types of things are happening in the sector so that you can see where you can add the most value. As I mentioned earlier, our sector tends to be quite weak in DEI when you look at the industry side, not so much on the training side. So really thinking about how are we going to enhance DEI within our companies as they grow and develop is a priority for this sector and for our organization. So as we look at this supply labor puzzle, as we sometimes talk about it, it comes down to a quantity issue as well as a match of what skills people have and how do we ensure that they have the skills that people are looking for. And so what you'll see on the next slide is we had a number of recommendations as it relates to the sector, and many of those involve innovative training programs. So this was the recommendations that came out of the labor market study. And one that we are currently we're kicking off right now is to create a single voice for the sector. So Life Sciences BC is going to be creating a talent council that will consist of representation from academia, industry, and industry bringing that broad group of large companies, SMEs, and digital health medtech, and biotech, to really be the voice of the sector, stay on top of trends, and be able to represent the sector with those decision makers and influencers on how to address, whether it be training programs or immigration issues, or what have you. We've got certain qualifications issues, but we want to ultimately have BC be a very competitive place for people to attract and retain labor. Many things that come into this, of course, is to ensure that we have a globally competitive ecosystem so that we are a place that people want to work. So continuing to do that broader ecosystem work. In addition, having a talent attraction marketing plan. So something that many companies have brought up is they are fine doing their own recruiting efforts, but they're often asked the question of, if this job doesn't end up working out, what else do we have in this sector? And our organizations are looking for support where we can provide that broader overall viewpoint of what's happening. So as an example, if you want to work in lipid nanoparticles and it doesn't work out at company X, well, there are about 14 lipid nanoparticle companies working in Vancouver today. The same conversation would happen with cell and gene therapy and antibody companies. I've talked about DEI. Number 5 is really a very short recommendation that has a lot underneath it as it relates to innovative training programs, whether they be working with academia, whether they be with industry collaborative PhD programs with academia, where people can do more of their time in industry, which happens in some other jurisdictions, micro-credentialing, professional development. There's a lot under there of really looking how to not only have people leave academia with the right skills, but throughout their career, have a way of upskilling. And that's really also where the Biomanufacturing Training Center comes in. We are beginning consultations with Indigenous organizations to foster meaningful sector engagement, which is a really important initiative as we look ahead. And then continuing to look to support the companies grow and attract anchor companies in BC. So, and that labor market report is available on our website. I think there's a link to it at the end, but I know Diana has shared it already, but she may share it again, or otherwise, as I say, it's available on our website. If you didn't see an article that was published on March 9th in the Globe and Mail, there's a 4,000-word feature article by Sean Silkoff that talks about Vancouver and really looks at how Vancouver is poised to really become a major global pharma capital. So definitely worth the read. It is a great it's an article that, if you are in the Vancouver ecosystem, one that makes you very proud, but also effectively talks about a little bit of the secret sauce that's happening in Vancouver, but isn't also shy about the things that we need to do to really realize that dream. In addition, it's a great history lesson because he went back and really talked about the previous year that the biotech sector was previous in the 80s, what was happening, and then where we are today. So definitely worth the read. Just a little bit about what's happening as we look ahead. We did, as many of you may know, we have a number of events a year, and we did a couple as it related to AI and digital technologies that we thought we would highlight. So there's a lot of transformation that's happening with digital, which again takes you right back into the skills that people have as they're entering into the sector. But digitization of laboratory services is something that is very top of mind, and how the labs of the future are going to work. And I sort of almost feel silly bringing this up because I would imagine many of you are have much more in-depth knowledge than me on this topic, but certainly something to think about as you're looking at your careers and where you may want to go is having those skills that are going to help to drive and accelerate discovery and research, and using the technology tools that we have available to us today and leveraging those in the future are a really big trend that is happening. AI, of course, I almost feel like you can't go through any presentation lately without talking about AI. We did 2 speaker series on AI most recent in February and March. And, you know, the main areas that we see this happening is obviously in drug discovery, AI powering clinical trials, some really interesting work that is happening that really leads you to the way we conduct clinical trials and very specifically find patients in the future is really, really exciting, and which would result in clinical trials being started faster and hopefully results being seen in a much more timely manner, depending on the technology and what the trial is about. Personalized medicine and personalized healthcare is clearly, you know, something that is continuing to progress, and hopefully we're getting closer to the promise of that. And then AI in medical imaging and diagnostics, there's a lot of innovation happening in both number 3 and 4, specifically in BC. I would also add to this, the Ministry of Health is really looking at AI and thinking about, hey, how AI can be used within the healthcare system itself, beyond personalized healthcare, but even in the administration side and numerous processes within our health delivery system. So as we think about this, and you know, many will believe this, and I'm sure Frank will talk about it as well, Canada does have deep strength in this area, and we need to continue to double down on that and demonstrate the promise of it and demonstrate results on how we can use this in a manner that will continue to advance the life sciences sector and advance us as a globally competitive life sciences sector. So here are some links to some of what I've referred to. So our website, we have a job board specifically that you might want to keep your eyes on. It's quite active. Biotalent Canada's website, which has numerous reports that are more nationally focused. They also have a job board, which is called Petri Dish. And then our labor market study, there's a link to that as well.
Well, once again, thank you for the invitation. It's a real pleasure for me to be here. You know, I was listening to Wendy's presentation, and besides the fact we have the same word in our title and in our presentation, which is vibrant, I must say that we have lots of common things that we could have used some of our slides, basically. So I guess my angle will be a little bit different. I'm sure I don't have to convince you anymore that considering having a career in the life sciences sector is absolutely a very good idea. And I just want to say that it is definitely the case pretty much in all regions in Canada, but certainly in BC and Quebec. So I guess my focus will be more on presenting a few data on the Quebec life sciences sector, and so just to let you understand that it is another possible destination for all of you, basically. So first of all, a few words on Montréal InVivo itself. So who are we? If you read the mission statement and the vision and what's on the slide, you understand that our job basically as a non-for-profit is to create the best possible business environment here in the Montreal metro region, and the best possible business environment for life sciences and health technologies organizations. Next slide. Okay. So I like to describe Montréal InVivo as being industry-led, university-fueled, and mostly, I would say, government-funded, because approximately 60% of my budget comes from the 3 levels of government, and 40% comes from the private sector. So Montreal InVivo represents basically 80% of the province's life sciences sector. The other regions where there is a concentration of life sciences is Quebec City and the region of the city of Sherbrooke as well. And I would say that our ecosystem, we are blessed because it is a very, very diversified ecosystem. So in other words, we have companies, large, small companies, from all the subset sectors of the life sciences, basically biopharma, but including biotech, medtech company, digital health companies, service companies. All those companies are part of, we have companies in all those segments. And also we have, of course, strong research capabilities, and that's something that I totally agree with Wendy saying when she was saying that Canada, we are blessed because we have very, very strong research infrastructures and very, very strong researchers as well. So we have the tools and we have the brains for making new discoveries that hopefully will transfer into innovations. So so we have that in Quebec as well, in Montreal as well. Maybe one thing that is slightly different is the very strong presence of financial institutions, and most specifically venture capitalists that we have. We have a strong concentration of them in Montreal and in Quebec. So they are very, very important contributors to our ecosystem. And I like to add to that also the presence of and the support of the government, which by the policy making capability they have, they obviously have a very strong influence on the whole ecosystem. Excuse me. So what do we do at Montreal InVivo? So I said, okay, our job is to try to build the best possible business environment, but on the day-to-day, what do? We do, first of all, we do business intelligence. So basically studies, things like that, to better understand certain aspects affecting the market or the ecosystem. And then around the data we gather through that business intelligence, we do a lot of mobilization of the different stakeholders of the ecosystem. And we do that around issues, challenges, opportunities that we feel are shared by many of the stakeholders. And those discussions are basically fueled by the business intelligence that we have gathered before. Then from those, when you put a lot of people around the table, which is now most of the time a virtual table, you have people that are that have some ideas. Well, they share what are the problems, what are the challenges or the opportunities, but and basically we rank them with them. And then many times they have some good ideas on how to solve those problems. So that's our job now for us within my organization, to transform those ideas into real projects. So the projects, what we call high impact or structuring projects, we design them, we find the initial funding for that, and then get the project approved by the board of directors. And when the projects they go back in the field, the acceptance or acceptability rate is very high, because basically both the problem and the solutions they come from the sector, from the field, basically. So that's really bottom-up approach. The fourth type of thing that we do is the promotion of the sector. In other words, making sure that everybody that has a say in making a decision affecting our ecosystem understand that the importance and the impact of our ecosystem. It's very, very important. So we don't target necessarily the general public, because this is beyond our reach. Basically, we don't have the budget for that, but we make sure that we make the decision makers understand the importance of our sector, and we go back to that later. And the last type of activities that we do at Montreal InVivo is basically to support one-on-one, really, entrepreneurs and startups in their early days, if I can say, for instance, through a training program or mentoring program, that kind of thing. So that's in a nutshell what we do. And I would like to add to that we have 5 strategic priorities at Montréal InVivo, and one of them is basically the talent pool. So in other words, we want to make sure that we have the right talent pool in quantity and in quality. In other words, we want enough people to work in the companies of the ecosystem, but we want the right people with the right training for being able to find the jobs and fill the positions that Wendy mentioned earlier in her study. So we have different types of programs and projects on that specific. Just an example, I mentioned quickly the mentoring program that we have been running for maybe 12 years now. We launched some training programs on entrepreneurship, for instance, or on data sciences. We looked at a survey we did a few years ago, and basically we realized that we had lots of people that had a biological science type of training that were having difficulties to find jobs in the ecosystem, where on the other end of the spectrum, there were companies, let's say that AI companies, for instance, looking for employees. So by giving those people with a biological science background a training on data science, they became what I call bilingual. In other words, they had a very, very appealing type of profile for companies looking for the right people and being able to understand and dialogue with either the end user on the biological side or the engineers developing the apps or the algorithm. Also, another type of training program that we put together with a collaboration with Castle on the biomanufacturing, something relatively similar to what Wendy mentioned before. The other type of things we like to do is try to get closer and closer to what I call la relève. So basically, students or very, very young professionals, but mostly students. You know, for example, during our last week, actually, during our large event, Effervescence 2024, which is now the largest life sciences event in Canada, I think, with close to 600 participants, we had an evening with students where they could meet in small groups professionals from the industry, so they could exchange and ask questions basically on what it is like to work in the life sciences sector and what were the pathway to get there basically. So that's another example of the type of activities that we have for younger talent. And the last thing, equity, diversity, inclusion. Very strong for us. It's a very big question for me and my team. We've launched a strategic committee on that aspect a couple of years ago now, and more than that actually. And we are just finishing a study. Actually, I had a presentation just a few hours ago to have some kind of a real sense of what is the situation of EDI within companies in the ecosystem. And from there, we will try to identify a few high impact actions that could help improve the data, because basically, I mean, there's no way hiding it, but I mean, we are no better than any other sector basically in the life sciences sector. So we may say, okay, we are very open and everything, but in the reality, when you look at the numbers, we're not that great. So we're not better than the other sector. So we have to start, you know, putting together actions that are actually meaningful and impactful. Okay, so vibrant again. So I'm going to share quite a few data with you. I'm sorry about that. I know it could be boring, but I think it shows really the importance and the strength of the sector in Quebec. And it's another way for me to try to convince everybody around to choose actually the life sciences sector as a career, and possibly in Quebec as well, because it is definitely a very strong ecosystem that we have here. So I'll start with some big numbers. You know, when we talk about GDP, the gross domestic product, that's basically the value of a given sector. 2021, we were over $6.5 billion, which is an addition of actually an increase of $1 billion since the last time we measured it, which was in 2018. So that's a quite interesting growth, I would say. And today, the life sciences sector represents 1.1% of the total GDP of Quebec. So we could say that we are a very strong contributor to the province's economy. And on top of that, I picked up some data on the income. Basically, even though we have 1.1% of Quebec's GDP, our sector represents almost, let's say, 1.44% of the total province income. So in other words, when you add the salaries of the life sciences sector versus the total of all the salaries of the working population, we represent a bit more than 1.4% of all of that. And basically, that's the average salary in Quebec in the life sciences sector is $77K, which is good. And this is probably one of the reasons why the government loves our sector so much, because it means a lot of income taxes, of course. And our prime minister here is always looking at industries, or not looking at, but interested in developing industries where the average salary is above 50K. So that's exactly us. And that strong, that economic contribution leads to a good response when we ask for support from the government. And I'll go back to that later. Now, some data on employment specifically. You can see from that study that was we did last year, and actually we're going to have new numbers in a few weeks or a couple of months maybe with the 2022 data. But anyways, Quebec in life sciences ranks number 10 in North America. We looked at 15 different jurisdictions, and today Quebec ranks number 10. So that's and we gained 1 rank since the last time we did that study. So that's basically a bit more than 52,000 jobs in the life sciences sector in Quebec. And this is actually the second largest ecosystem in Canada. The first one is actually Ontario, of course. But Quebec is actually the only province that gained 1 rank in the top 15 ranking from the last study. Ontario was stable, and we gained that rank from Minnesota, basically. So we passed Minnesota. The other jurisdiction that gained 1 rank was Florida, which is interesting because it is now bigger than Pennsylvania. And when you think about life sciences in North America, you wouldn't think that Florida is actually a good destination. And Pennsylvania definitely was top of mind, I would say. Then, if you look at the evolution of the employment, or in other words, the growth of employment. So Quebec is now top 3 in North America, which is impressive. Even more impressive, I must say, BC is BC. Sorry, I realize that the figures are in French, but you probably understand that Colombie-Britannique means British Columbia. So with an impressive 25% growth, so that's BC ranks number 1. Quebec and Alberta, we are very, very close. But in terms of size, we are close in terms of growth, but Quebec is much bigger in terms of absolute numbers, in terms of size, as we saw before, even bigger than BC, about twice the size of BC in terms of the number of jobs. And if you look at Ontario, which still has nearly 4% growth over the period, but it is relatively stagnant, I would say, at the bottom of the ranking. Speaking of Ontario, I always love, teasing my colleagues from Ontario, and we could have my friend Jason Field from Life Sciences Ontario on that same panel, and I would love to show you that slide. I like to compare that the what we call the compound annual growth rates over the period, and you can see that in Quebec we had a growth of 5.6%. And we grew that in every sub-segment of the sector, with actually the strongest growth in the diagnostic and in the field of service companies like CROs and CMOs. And we are significantly, in terms of growth, better than Ontario. So it's always a little pleasure for me to tease my friends from Ontario with those statistics. A few more numbers. When you look at labor intensity, so in other words, the proportion of jobs in life sciences versus the total number of jobs in a given territory. So that's the labor intensity in life sciences. So Quebec ranks now in the top 5, which is great, because I believe that it is a very, very important factor to sustain growth and the level of expertise that is required for a given sector. And if you like, if you look at, for instance, a jurisdiction like Massachusetts, they are basically on another planet. I would say this is a totally different ball game with a labor intensity of 4%. But pretty much the other jurisdictions are relatively similar in terms of numbers, between 1.3, 1.4. So that is important to have that kind of labor intensity if we want to make sure that over the long term we can grow and sustain the growth of our sector. So all those numbers basically, I know it could be boring, but my message here is that life sciences is a very, very interesting and strong sector in Canada, generally speaking. That's exactly the case in BC. We saw that before, and that's exactly the case, and even bigger, I would say, in Quebec. So I'm not trying to say, okay, you have to don't go to BC or to Ontario, go to Quebec. I'm just saying that wherever you are in Canada, there are very, very strong clusters where you can find very, very good jobs and very stimulating jobs, and in a sector where you can be pretty much sure that, yeah, there are some very, very good prospects in terms of growth, in terms of being able to find jobs and keep jobs and grow within those jobs. And the last slide I wanted to share with you is the fact that because all of those numbers, as I said before, governments, they tend to love our sector a lot. And that's the case at the federal level, when we mentioned that. At the provincial level, I'd say that our provincial level, and whatever the color of the government in place, they always supported the life sciences sector. And actually, Quebec was the first province to release a life sciences strategy, provincial life sciences strategy, in 2017. Yeah, 2017. So now we are into the second edition of that life sciences strategy, which added another $211 million to support it. So it's just words, on a piece of paper. It's actually some real dollars going into the ecosystem to support the ecosystem, and also to generate investments and private investments. And the plan with the life sciences strategy is to be able to stimulate private investments of over $4 billion over the period, which is fantastic. And we'll see if we can get to that number, but the interim reports seem to be very positive about that. And actually next year, 2025, is when we will be hopefully working with the government of Quebec to renew and have a new version of that life sciences strategy, and hopefully a new game plan for the next 5 to 10 years for the life sciences sector. And more generally speaking, kind of on top of the life sciences strategy at the provincial level, there is also a research and innovation strategy, which is obviously covering broader than just life sciences, but which also has a significant amount of dollar that can be invested in research and innovation, because we're talking about $7.5 billion. And the goal of that research and innovation strategy is basically to increase productivity and wealth in Quebec. And so we can also get some support from that research and innovation strategy from Quebec. So these strategies have led to some significant investment. I mentioned it. Wendy mentioned AI. Of course, we have the NMIN in Montreal, which is the largest, actually the largest AI research lab. Actually, it's specifically based on the work of Professor Yoshua Bengio, which is actually today, I think, one of the most, if not the most cited scientists in the world, and is very, very, very strong, and is considered as one of the fathers of the AI, and we are lucky to have him in Montreal. So there were some significant investments there. Recently, we saw also Moderna, which chose Quebec and Montreal, and actually to set up its new facility, biomanufacturing facility, so to biomanufacture vaccines and other products. Actually, there was a visit just before Effervescence on Monday, and everybody was totally impressed by the state-of-the-art for such a relatively small, I would say, manufacturing plant, when you think of the number of vaccines that they will generate, but the footprint is not that big, but the automation is fantastic. So basically, Moderna invested some money here, and other investments that were announced last week during Effervescence. So basically, a very strong government support, very strong private sector investments. And again, my message here is clearly choosing life sciences and health technologies in Quebec or in other places in Canada is definitely a good move and a good choice. So that's it for me, and I'm ready to take some questions.
So to kick off, I see Anthony Tam has asked a question in the Q&A. So I'll read that out. And I think this question is directed to both of you. So I'll just read it and you can both provide responses. Anthony writes, my colleagues are aware that sometimes academic education may not necessarily be in alignment with what biotech industries need their candidates to know. What would some sort of broad spectrum educational materials approach prior to employment that tailors the knowledge industries need to be helpful to reduce the cost and time of retraining at the workplace be available? Are institutions using this targeted educational approach? So any comments to that in terms of sort of systematic preparation of employees, future employees for this sector? So Frank, do you want to kick off?
Yes, not totally sure, but what you mean by broad spectrum educational material approach. But basically, the premise of the question is totally right. There's sometimes a disconnect between what people are trained for and what are the actual needs of the industry. But there are ways to mitigate that problem, I would say. And what we're trying to push actually is to have more of those internships type of alternance. I am not sure how to say that in English, but basically students spending more time in the company to learn the ropes, basically, and have a more a good sense of what is the real life in the company. And on the other hand, we do encourage to have a lot of discussion, a lot of dialogue between the training facility, the universities, for instance, and industry. They need to have that kind of dialogue, and that's our job, that's our role, so to make sure that the dialogue happens, and so there's less of a disconnect. And I'll take just one example. When we learned that Moderna had chosen Montreal for its biomanufacturing facility, first thing we did was, okay, let's map out what are all the training programs related to biomanufacturing, first thing. Then let's ask to Moderna, but also the other companies, what are the skills they want to have for their employees, future employees, and try to assess what is the gap. And then based around those gaps, make sure that the conversation could happen and see what could be done. And sometimes it is very, very difficult to change a university program, but you can add some continual education type of program, so it's faster and easier to tailor-made to the need of the industry. And we were lucky also because Castle chose Montreal to set up a training facility that is 100% dedicated to biomanufacturing, basically. And so they made a partnership with Moderna, once again, to give the students an additional hands-on type of experience and training, so they are not totally disoriented when they start working on the manufacturing plant.
Excellent, thanks, Frank. And Wendy, you did touch on this in your presentation. Do you want to elaborate a little more?
Sure, thanks. I wouldn't say that the skill, like, as I said in my presentation, there's a recognition that people, as they're graduating from our academic institutions, have can stand on their own, on their technical skills, even competitively with US schools. So I'm not sure I would say it's a mixed match, rather that it's what are those other skills that you need to be successful within the sector. And Frank just touched on it. So both Quebec and BC have our own biomanufacturing training centers that are being established, leveraging the Castle criteria. And that the intent of the facility, I'm not as familiar in Montreal, but I mean in Quebec, but I assume it's the same, is that can be part of the traditional academic route. BCIT has a biotechnology program. It can also be leveraged by other academic programs. So some of the biomedical engineering programs are planning on leveraging that facility. It can also be leveraged by industry to be able to take some of their employees and train as they're building up biomanufacturing capabilities. I think where the opportunity is as individuals who really need to own your learning journey. If you're in BC or any of the provinces, one of the things that you really want to do is learn about the industry and learn about what the opportunities are. So attend LSBC events, InVivo Frank just hosted Effervescence, as he mentioned, which is a great opportunity of bringing together academia, research, and industry, early stage companies, larger companies, investors, etc. We have an event called Career Connect Day in January every year, which has become the largest career-focused life sciences event in the country. We had 550 people in attendance last year. It's a fantastic opportunity to not only learn about this sector, but we have about 30 organizations that are set up in a trade show style format, so you can go and talk to them. So really owning your own opportunities of learning is really important. But in addition, this is where micro-credentialing and some of these other programs come into play. UBC has just created a regulatory one as an example. I had 2 meetings yesterday about micro-credentialing, one related to IP, one related to something else. So really understanding how to upskill yourself and what opportunities those are along the way. Absolutely, there's opportunities, as Frank said, to also for industry and academia to work more closely together. That's one of the reasons why I sit on the industry advisory board of the UBC School of Biomedical Engineering, because they really want to have that industry input as they're evolving their programming and their curriculum and playing a bigger role in the innovation economy and what can happen. Like Frank, we had a training executive steering committee, which is the thing that ended up resulting in the biomanufacturing center. So very similar approach. And for us, with our talent council, that's also going to be a big part of it, is what are the skills that we're seeing that people don't have and what's the best way to go about finding them. But I would say a lot, an under leveraged resource for people in their early stage careers is attending the events that the industry professionals are at, because it's such a great opportunity to learn. And I'm not saying it just because I'm LSBC, it's what other leaders say to me, and they're starting to bring their, their earlier stage employees so that they can actually have the opportunity to learn.
Thanks, Wendy. So Andrew Varley had asked the question. I think it has been answered, as Andrew noted in a subsequent comment on the chat. But where can people go if they're looking to learn about the industry trends? And so I think that's been partly answered. I'm going to broaden that question and go beyond the Canadian perspective, because I think all of these sectors exist in a global context in terms of their viability and their markets. And so what kind of specific conferences or events would you recommend that people attend? And keep in mind, NMIN has some funding to send people to these events over the next year if they so choose to attend. But which sort of North American events or global conferences or websites would you recommend they follow if they want to see what the global trends are, the international perspective, broader than just Canada or BC or Quebec?
The other thing I was going to mention, which doesn't necessarily answer your question, but also many of us have newsletters. We have a newsletter every week that picks up both our members' news, but also industry news. So that's another, you can read it in 5 minutes or half an hour. But as for the global trends, and I'll let Frank, global conferences, and I'll let Frank jump in. It's not really answering your question, Diana, because it really depends on, like, if you're going to make the decision to go to a global conference, or for that matter, even a local conference, you have to be really clear about what objectives you have and how are you going to achieve those objectives. So as an example, we're leading the BC delegation to BIO. We'll end up with like 55 member organizations with us. We have a presence on the floor. We have a very clear objective. We're there to raise the profile of this sector, promote this sector, and look for those investment and business development and licensing opportunities for our members, and meet with investors so they will come to our Invest in BC conference. There are so many conferences available right now. Like, there are just so many. And it is very easy to go to a conference and get lost. And so I can't tell, if you're interested in lipid nanoparticles, and there's like a million of those. So I can't say which conference is better or not. I would go off of word of mouth from people that you trust, that have attended them before, that have been there. But I would also be really, really clear on what your objectives are and how you're going to go about achieving those objectives. Because it's very easy to go and plop yourself into some city for 5 days for a conference and just not achieve. If you don't know what you're trying to achieve, yes, you'll meet some interesting people, but you have to be really purposeful in managing your time when you're out in some of these things. And it's okay to go. I went to the JP Morgan conference last year, and I was on a reconnaissance trip. I was running around trying to figure out whether or not there was a good role for us to play, which we determined there was. But again, that was the objective. And so I'm not, despite the fact I'm aware of a number of conferences, I'm not the person to say which conference so-and-so should go to when I don't even know what they're trying to achieve.
So I think what I'm taking from this is there are many international conferences you could go to, but you've got to be strategic in selecting one that's aligned with your area of interest or the career path that you're seeking to secure for yourself. So I think that's great advice. Frank, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, actually, the having the right good objectives is very important. But let's assume that someone wants to go to a general, macro type of event. Of course, bio is the place to go, but it could be very intimidating. It's like, I don't know, 11, 12, 13,000 people attending the conference. So it's as Wendy said, it's easy to get lost. So you have to have very specific objectives and know exactly what you'd like to learn and who you like to see and whether you like what, because those conferences are very, very expensive. So but if you want to have a broad view of what's happening, have a sense, let's say, of what's happening, could be a good place to go. But as I said, it's quite expensive. And if you are more interested in the medical devices industry, then you should go, the equivalent would be the MedTech conference by AdvaMed in September, October at time, I think. That's another very good conference to go to. But again, you have to be clear of what are your expectations, because again, you could get lost a lot easily in those big conferences. But yeah, on the other hand, if you want to go to some very targeted, more scientific type of conferences, that's fine too. But that's, I would say, part of your regular, the type of thing you are expected to do when you're a researcher, right? So more business oriented conferences are good, but you know what? I would definitely start with some local events, because you get to better understand what is the right language, what it is exactly, how you should behave, and kind of thing. So, and you have a at least a local view of what you think is interesting to you, and then with that as an input, you can decide to go to a larger conference in the US, for instance, and dig deeper on that specific area that you're interested in. Sorry.
Well, thank you for that, Frank. We, NMIN just hosted a week or so ago a networking workshop in Vancouver for our trainees as our final in-person event. And this really resonates with the advice we got from the workshop leader. They suggested if you're going to go to one of these big conferences, you've got to really prepare. So not only be strategic in terms of what your goals are, but to list a number of questions that you're seeking answers to, and just be very persistent. And, if you want to meet specific people, just make that list and show it to everybody that you're talking to, and someone's going to know someone who knows that person. So it's really.
But actually, Diana, those big conferences, they have B2B platforms that are very, very efficient. So you can book your meetings ahead of time. So it's a very efficient way to spend time there. But once again, it costs a lot.
Yeah, that's a great tip as well. I just want to add to the information being shared that there was a very important federal government announcement on Monday in Montreal that announced the funding for the Canadian Biomedical Research Fund and some biomedical research infrastructure funds, so the CBRIF and the BRIF. And the University of Toronto group led by Gilbert Walker and Molly Shoichet, Gilbert is the scientific director of NMIN, received funding for something called BioHubNet, and it's money for training people in biomanufacturing. So it's it's intended to be a national program. So you might want to take a look at it. And it is located at University of Toronto, and it's co-sponsored by Toronto Metropolitan University, which used to be Ryerson University. But it is training HQP for Canadian biomanufacturing and employment in the life sciences ecosystem. So that's something that's coming on stream, and that certainly, if Wendy and Frank, if you're not aware of it, you might want to look into that, because it would be very relevant to some of the gaps that you've identified. And Wendy mentioned Castle. There's also other, I wouldn't call it a micro-credential, but Mari Bioinnovation has training programs for more advanced in the management leadership areas where gaps were identified in the study that Wendy presented. So there are a lot of things coming on stream, which are very exciting and certainly will intensify our strength within the ecosystem writ large. So that's very encouraging. I have a question for, I think, Wendy and Frank together. Wendy, I want to thank you for sharing that Globe and Mail article. It's actually quite profoundly moving to see the developments in Vancouver. Whoever that journalist was did an amazing job of a deep dive and putting that story together. And so if you haven't read it, I think I shared it with this group, and Divya, I think maybe shared it in the chat, but it's really worth reading. But the question that I'm getting to here, Frank and Wendy, has there been a sea change in terms of us as Canadians feeling that somebody else needs to do this for us? Whereas now that article, it really suggests in Vancouver, Accelera and many other what started as small startup companies are really taking the bull by the horns here, and they are building the physical infrastructure to support clinical trials in Canada and physical infrastructure to support large companies employing people. And then we've got Stem Cell Technologies, which is a great role model for all the other companies that came after. But, you know, has something really changed, and are we finally finding our footing and starting to take matters into our own hands as an ecosystem and not waiting for government or just waiting for a buyout? What are your thoughts there?
Do you want me to go first, Frank? Yeah. Okay.
Go ahead.
Well, I think there has been a sea change, and I'll just, start, at the federal level. So of course we had the $2.2 billion biomanufacturing and life sciences strategy that the federal government announced. And you referenced the hubs, Diana. That was part of it, the 5 hubs that have been created across the country, which that announcement was about yesterday. And I think there were 19 projects funded for something like $500,000 or something like that. But I think it's important to reflect on the core elements of that federal strategy. And it really is under the backdrop of some of the learnings that came out of the pandemic, which was we really did not have a lot onshore that we were able to leverage. And if you talk to some of the people at the federal government level, that was a pretty brutal reality to be faced with. And then you had borders closing. While we kept our border open, some people were not prepared to supply to us. So a lot of that strategy and a lot of the thinking is still very much rooted in health security and health emergency preparedness. And so that has multiple tenets. So how do we decide, how do we ensure that? Well, first and foremost, we have to have a strong life sciences ecosystem. So that's a big part of it. We want to understand, there's a terminology that's used quite frequently called tradables. So what are our tradables? You could argue that Acuitas was a tradable. If you go back, if you look at it, in the rear view mirror. Acuitas had been working with BioNTech for 5 years on cancer-related innovation. They pivoted very quickly, found that they could make a vaccine, and then Pfizer came in and scaled it and commercialized it. Our negotiations with Pfizer to get the vaccine in Canada were a little bit simpler, given that there was Canadian innovation in there. And so there has been lots of discussions at the federal government about what are our strategic tradables and what are they going to be in the future. And again, while you can't necessarily define what the next health emergency is going to be, you have to have a strong ecosystem, and you have to have awareness over what your strengths as an ecosystem are in order to understand what tradables you have. Accelera would be another tradable. They discovered the first therapeutic, and then Eli Lilly scaled it. Now, so you have that backdrop of health security and health emergency preparedness is really important. Mm-hmm. So when you think about the life sciences sector, without me going into my economics background that I have to start talking about deficits and the state of our, current economics in Canada, and lots of articles recently about productivity and etc. The life sciences sector, I've said many times, has a double helix benefit, both about job creation and economic diversification. And if we leverage these tools to address some of the productivity gaps, while the products, solutions, and services are so critical to addressing some of the health needs and health emergency needs. I would also say the life sciences sector is positioned squarely at the human health impacts related to climate change, which is also, at least on the West Coast, been in the news recently as people are talking about firefighters and respiratory challenges that they have over time. And as fire season ends up being much broader, how are we ensuring that we're protecting the firefighters, both from a preventative perspective, but also addressing the health impacts that they have as a result of their roles? So, this is a very important sector on many levels. Other than, of course, the science is exciting and it's a super fun sector to work in because you learn something new every day. But the other element of this is geopolitically, there's a lot of onshoring going on around the country and around the globe. And we have to recognize that in Canada, we are never going to produce everything ourselves. It's just unrealistic. 4 years ago, I remember there was like this, oh, we're going to get everyone to come and manufacture in Canada. That's not going to happen. So what we have to do is have a strong sector, understand our strength, have good trading relationships, have policies in place that are going to be really important to attract capital, develop our talent so that we can reach our potential of all of the science that we have. I mean, I look at the science of what we've had many conversations that we're blessed with world-class science. Those are the raw materials of the sector, if you think about it from a business perspective. So then we have to scale it, translate it. So, I mean, I think it's important to have that macro backdrop that is driving a bit of that sea change. And remember to keep it rooted in that, because these are, real issues that people are really grappling with, that we need to make sure, as some leaders have said, that the outcome of the pandemic is amnesia. Rather, the outcome of the pandemic is a stronger Canadian life sciences ecosystem that is prepared for health security and health emergencies, which may not be COVID. They could be something else. And I was recently participating in a trade mission to Washington that was all focused on life sciences supply chain. And the global supply chain lead from Stryker kicked off her speech with saying, I just activated my emergency preparedness plan last night for 4 hours. And that was because Taiwan had earthquakes. And 80% of the chips globally are manufactured in Taiwan. So the reverberating impacts of that earthquake were pretty significant for our sector and many other sectors. And while I was sitting in Washington, was very aware of the Baltimore Bridge that had just fallen apart 5 days earlier. And there would be huge amounts of medical supplies in those tankers, whether they were stuck in the harbor or stuck in to get into the harbor. And so there are tons of learnings coming out of the pandemic that are really driving a lot of these strategies that are important for us to remember as this sea change happens and the global supply chain is really evolving. I don't know if that's what you were looking for, but
no, that's really thought-provoking. And just, the silver lining of COVID is replete in these examples that you provided. Frank, what are your thoughts on that matter?
I don't know if it's linked to COVID or post-COVID or whatever, but I have gray hair, so that means I've been around for a long time, and I saw the evolution of the sector, and I will speak more specifically here for Quebec. And maybe one thing I observe is the fact that we feel maybe less shy now to talk about developing and building and developing, real anchor companies in Quebec. Maybe it's something that is typical to Quebec, but in the past it was almost I don't know, I'm looking at Ines here because she's an investor in some of those companies, but some of those companies they were not seeing themselves as being potentially those, strong leaders, being a leader not just in Quebec, but in Canada and North America. And I think we have more and more now of those executives that are, or entrepreneurs that are seeing themselves as potentially being able to do that. And actually a few of the latest exits we had in the sector, are very encouraging in this. And thinking of an anchor company, and if you look at the study that was made by Admare, it is very encouraging that yes, now that's the kind of discussion, that's the kind of talk that we have. We want to have those anchor companies in Quebec and in Canada, so we wouldn't be, usually our companies are the prey of big beasts from the US or from Europe. So hopefully in a few years, our companies will be the predators, and we acquire more and more companies from the US or from Europe, and we're seeing that kind of spirit more now, and I think it's a very good thing.
Excellent, thank you. And Frank, you mentioned Ines Holzbauer, and I'd like to introduce Ines. She's on the panel and on the screen, and welcome Ines. Ines is the board chair of the Nanomedicine Innovation Network, and she's also the founder and managing partner of Amorcan in Montreal, which is a venture capital company for early stage startups. And Ines, I would invite you to make any comment you'd like to make, observations you may have before we wrap up today. Just have to take yourself off mute. Or maybe Divya can unmute you. It should be at the bottom left.
Sorry, yes, I found it. That's what COVID did to all of us. We now know how to find the mute button. I think it's been very interesting to listen to Frank and Wendy talk about the two ecosystems and the issues. I'd be very curious to know what how much support, because in both provinces we're talking about governmental support for the industry and everything. But when we look at the wage gap, or sorry, not the wage gap, the labor puzzle, as Wendy called it, part of the problem, many of the problems are macroeconomic problems where we do need support from governments, not just to the life science ecosystem, but to other ecosystems as well. But I wonder how much support we are getting and how much governments are listening to the specific problems of the life sciences industry, which is generally an industry that requires highly skilled, highly trained, highly educated workforce, a workforce that is probably a little bit more mobile, or generally more mobile than in other industries. So questions of immigration, questions of fiscal questions, all of these things that don't necessarily aren't necessarily in the brief of the different ministries that the life sciences industry fall under. I wonder how much you're being listened to when you talk about these problems. This might be a very general question for the last 4 minutes of the talk, but this is something that I was interested as I was coming on. But so the one thing that I would say more generally is that what's very interesting and might not be completely apparent is that the Quebec life sciences industry really grew from very many pharma companies being present. That had a first sort of spurt of growth of the biotech sector, and then the disappearance of these companies as research centers. They're still there. Otherwise, gave the sector a specific flavor, which is entirely different when you look at BC and when we're talking about anchor companies here out east. I think we do very well to look at the BC model, where the anchor companies were what created the sector essentially, and the sector didn't come from large companies setting up and creating this ecosystem around them, but came from a really truly entrepreneur, angel-driven effort.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've done a lot of work in comparing BC to Quebec, and I think you've summarized, the origins extremely well. Going to your first question, how much is the government listening? Well, that's a large part of what our roles are, is to ensure that the government is aware and to try and bring the sector together with a common voice. Because we're not really helpful if we're all giving the government different messages and all, all saying different things, even though sometimes we try and say the same thing, but we're using different words. So vocabulary is actually important when you're talking to the government, I think. I have a few things, at least as it relates to BC, that I think have been the gift that just keeps on giving. Our first economic report was one of them, where it was the first time the BC government had looked at the sector. And there was actually a lot of discussion about defining what the sector was. And then we ended up, through a lot of work, defining it in a relatively similar manner than as the other provinces, so that we would be able to compare ourselves and have common language. We are, I would say there's more that we can do for sure. But I would say that we have been able to establish a relatively strong relationship with the BC government, and most importantly, credibility with the BC government around what are some of the issues. We also will often use language like talent is an issue for this sector. Like, that's clear. I mean, that's all we've talked about. It's also an issue for other sectors. And there's a lot, that's where reskilling comes in. Some sectors that may not be, may not be growing as quickly, or people want to change roles, or, the biomanufacturing, there are skills that are going to be developed in these sectors that don't necessarily have to be only applied within life sciences. And so we have to remember that we're trying to not compete as a sector. We're trying to have a rising tide lifts all boats within this. And so a lot of the programs, regulatory, yes, it's going to be focused on life sciences, but there's lots of sectors that have very strong regulatory environments here. I would say, one of the things that surprised me from our life sciences report, which again was funded by the government, so that would indicate that they think it's important to look at the sector, was the concept of creating a talent council really bubbled up through talking to people. I'll be honest, one of the things that has surprised me is how much attention that has garnered. That probably will be a game changer for us over the next 2 years, because we're going to come together as a sector. And I can tell you there's 3 different things I'm working on right now. One of them is around oversight of professional engineers, and to what extent people have to be, PNGs to work in our sector, which BC is taking a very different approach today. Another is, how do we get some of these jobs on the provincial nominee program, like what some other sectors have? These are going to be initiatives that we work on behalf of the sector that will benefit other sectors as well. And so we really need to continue to, work with them and help the government understand, because a lot of the role that the government plays, I mean, yes, they can run around and write checks, and some of the provinces do that more freely than others. BC is not one of those provinces that, that has quite as many of those initiatives as some of the others, but policy development is actually really critically important. And so how do we have policies that create this as a really competitive environment, that are ensuring that we're addressing some of the gaps that we have in order to advance, in order to continue to advance and make the sector strong? I don't know if that helps, but you're right. A lot of these are macroeconomic issues, but they're macroeconomic issues that are not, some of them, what the specifics are unique to the life sciences sector, but many of them are actually inherent across where we sit today economically for all of our provinces and federally.
So Wendy, I'm going to jump in and thank you there. And Frank, I'm going to give you a 1-minute opportunity. We're a little over time, but this has been very interesting. So Frank, any comments you'd like to make?
Well, to your point, Ines, that's true. That is our job to make sure that government listen to, generally speaking, all the challenges, the needs, the demands that we have. But to be honest, at the provincial level, our main body to which we talk is Minister of Economy. And some of the issues are way larger than that. And just think of the Ministry of Health, for instance, that has to be part of the solution sometimes, or education, or environment, and and that's complicated to not work in silos, because that's pretty much the way a government works. They have ministries and they work in silos, and it is a level of complexity for us now, because more and more the issues that we're facing are way larger than just economy related issues. So yeah, part of the challenge now.
Well, thank you, Frank, Wendy, and Ines. Thank you for that question. I'm going to ask the audience with us today to join me in thanking our invited speakers, Wendy and Frank, for their leadership within the Canadian life sciences ecosystem and for delivering today's very informative presentations.